I asked Brody, shouldn't we also look at some other compounds besides serotonin to see whether reserpine could act on those as well? Brody said no, he didn't think so. He was so sure serotonin was the most important compound when it, insofar as psychosis is concerned. So he thought it would be a waste of time. So I thought, okay, perhaps I can do that when I get home. So I wrote to an associate professor of histology in Lund, Nils-Åke Hillap. He had just made a very important discovery that in the adrenal medulla there are organelles that are capable of storing the adrenaline and noradrenaline, and actually they are stored together with ATP. It was very intriguing. And I thought maybe reserpine acts on these organelles. That's why I wrote to him, asked, should we look at this? And he agreed. And of course, it turned out to be absolutely true. It was actually on these organelles that reserpine acted. And because these organelles are the same in the adrenal medulla, in the serotonergic nerves, the same basic principle of storage. Hillap and I, we did these experiments and found that noradrenaline and adrenaline were depleted when you give reserpine. And we also found that if you stimulate the adrenergic nerves following reserpine treatment, they didn't respond anymore. So we believed that the neurotransmitter had gone and therefore the nerves couldn't function anymore. This was actually opposite hypothesis of Brody, because he believed that what reserpine does is that it causes an ongoing release, so it's more or less the opposite from the point of view of the function of the system. But we were in favor of the depletion hypothesis, so we thought if we have a very pronounced behavioral of reserpine, the animals become immobile and are heavily sedated. So we felt perhaps we can reverse this condition. We could perhaps then give noradrenaline and see which one is important here. But of course we couldn't give the amines themselves because they don't get into the brain, so we had to give the precursor. So we gave L-dopa and 5-hydroxytryptophan, and we found the most striking effect when we gave L-dopa, because the animals started to wake up within 10 minutes following an IV injection, and then they behaved like normal animals. We were so really excited by it, so we very quickly wrote a letter to Nature, sending also a photograph of this response. And they accepted the letter, but I didn't think the photography would really be worthwhile. At that time, when we had sent it off, we hadn't yet analyzed the brains. We were sure there should be a lot of noradrenaline in those brains, since the animals responded. And we were, of course, greatly disappointed when we found there is still no noradrenaline. So in order to save our faces, maybe at least we could see if dopamine is formed in the brain, because that is an intermediate between L-dopa and noradrenaline. So we had to develop a method for measuring dopamine, and then we found that sure enough the response to L-dopa could be correlated very closely to the formation and accumulation of dopamine in the brain. And also we found that dopamine does indeed occur in the brain under normal conditions, and not just in those small levels that you would assume that an intermediate would have. It was actually the levels were a little bit higher than those of noradrenaline. We were the first to identify dopamine in the brain, yes, and to propose a role for dopamine in the brain. So we were very excited, and we went to a meeting shortly after that, Hillap and I, in London, meeting on adrenergic mechanisms, and there were all the big shots with Sir Henry Dale on top, and reported on these things, and we were disappointed that they were not impressed, really. We had all kinds of questions. We thought now we really have to prove these amines do occur in nerves. And Hillap, he was a very clever histochemist, so he developed a method that enabled us to see these amines are located, and indeed they are in the nerves, they are not in the glia, and they had a distribution that was very much the same as in peripheral adrenergic nerves, where of course it was known already that noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter. So that I think was very important to convince the scientific community that in the brain you have chemical transmission also, as in the peripheral system, and not as was at that time generally believed. The transmission between nerves in neurons in the brain was electrical only. So this, I think, was the reason for a breakthrough actually of the concept of chemical transmission in the central nervous system.